Hey guys, and welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and this is where we're now in our home stretch, our final stretch for our lectures, our discussions on World War II. Before we begin our lecture proper, I would just like to do a customary recap and touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So, in our last lecture, we looked at the changing of the guards, so to speak, in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt had died. Roosevelt had died in office. He, of course, had been president since 1932. He won the election in 32. He was sworn in 1933, and he had run for re-election in every subsequent election. The next four elections will bear witness to Franklin Roosevelt running for the presidency. 1932, he wins it. 1936, he runs for re-election, his first term running for re-election. 1940, he breaks with protocol by running for an unprecedented third. And in 1944, he runs for an unprecedented fourth term, dying shortly after his inauguration. And he was succeeded by Harry Truman. Truman was an outsider, really, in the campaign, in the administration. He was not a close confidant or advisor to President Roosevelt. And Truman came in, and he was immediately blindsided with the fact that not only had there been an atomic weapon project, but that the project was successful, and that he had the decision of whether to drop atomic weapons on Japan. He ultimately chose to do so, and he chose the sites of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to demonstrate these weapons. And it was the atomic weapon, the use of these atomic weapons, that finally brought the Japanese to heel, with the Emperor Hirohito announcing the Japanese unconditional surrender. Well, the Japanese conditioned surrender. The one condition being that Hirohito be retained as emperor, and that he not be tried as a war criminal. And a great debate has raged over the atomic bombings ever since they were dropped during the and it was really prominent, really became a fixture in historical debates and also social debates during the anti-nuclear movement of the 1980s. Hiroshima and Nagasaki came to be regarded as unanswered war crimes perpetrated by the United States. On the surface, it was easy to understand why the government decided to do what it did, why Truman decided to do what he did. They were readying to unleash a massive conventional invasion of the Japanese archipelago. The bombs and the equipment, and the subsequent the bombs and the equipment and the men needed was of a massive scale. The bombing of those two cities and the subsequent surrender was a great relief to American service members and to the American political elite themselves, the American military community, the higher ranks. They were all relieved by this Japanese surrender. On the 2nd of September, the Japanese formally surrendered to General MacArthur on the deck of the USS Missouri. And the USS Missouri was chosen because the sitting president, Harry Truman, was from Missouri. Now, after the surrender, General MacArthur became the American commander in Japan and set about reorganizing and restructuring Japan, creating a Japanese democracy in the process. He displaced that military autocracy that had been in place throughout much of Imperial Japan's rise to regional and global ascendancy, regional and global power. The United States has lost more than 200,000 members of our armed forces, more than in any previous war, but a smaller number compared to the losses. A larger number than any of the previous foreign wars, Civil War, total combat related deaths completely dwarfed that sum. This was the most that the United States has lost in any foreign war, but a small number compared to the losses of the other major belligerents, like the Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, who lost millions of men. The United States emerged from the war in a much more strengthened position than she had entered it. The United States had recovered from the Great Depression, industry was revitalized, and she was a dominant military power vis-a-vis the other great powers. Moreover, the United States has suffered no great structural attacks, unlike the other powers. The United States was never bombed. There had never been any true terrestrial ramifications for the United States during this entire time period. Unlike the United Kingdom, Japan, the Soviet Union, France, Germany, she emerged structurally sound. World War II is one of the most popular subjects in the United States history. Its grip on American society is near absolute. Compared to other events, there have been countless movies, books, documentaries produced about this subject, college courses fill in record time, and numerous internet discussion boards have been devoted to quote unquote the greatest generation and quote unquote the good war. One of the things that was popularly said by this generation about their endeavors was that they were the greatest generation and that they fought the good war. And those discussions or talks or even feelings along those lines are constantly sprouting up. Now, this version of the war is filled with more misconceptions and myths than any other event in United States history, with maybe the exception of the United States Civil War regarding the controversy of slavery's influence on the Civil War. The myths associated with the war have dominated the American social perception of the world ever since. In this lecture, we're going to examine the popular view of World War II using the history of the war from a complete global perspective. We will also look at why these viewpoints developed and how they have influenced the policies of the Republic. Now, the popular image of the origins of the war is that dictators in Germany and Italy and Japan, drunk with power, sought to conquer the world after illegally seizing power in their homelands, in their home countries. Now, these powers then combined their resources to form the Axis alliance to accomplish their goal of global domination. They were viewed by American isolationism. They were viewed by the world of being aided by American isolationists in the 2 decades that followed the end of World War I, and by the British and the French policy of appeasement. In this interpretation, the policy of appeasement failed to stem the threat of war by whetting the appetite of the aggressors, allowing them to begin the war and strengthen their positions. The Axis powers came very close to victory in 1940-1941, being stopped by the belated recognition by the United States of the global significance of the war, and then the active fighting, the active persecution of the war by the United States, had they rallied to aid the United States in their fight against the Axis, the United Kingdom, China, and Russia, the Soviet Union, in their fight against the Axis. Now, the act that led the Axis power to declare war on the United States, the sneak attack on Pearl Harbor, perpetrated by the Japanese, is seen as the catalyst for motivating the Americans. The attack on Pearl Harbor, in this narrative, was thought to have been masterminded by Nazi Germany, with a small few holding that Franklin Roosevelt was the mastermind behind the whole thing, to galvanize public opinion and public support for joining the war. Now, the historical reality is, of course, totally different than this narrative. Before December 1944, there was no unified global struggle for war. The outbreak of hostilities between 1939 and 1941 were really just a group of separate regional disputes in East Asia and Europe that were unconnected. They became partially linked in late December 1941, but remained separate disputes. For example, and let me throw in Africa as well. This really was a global contest. Where was I? December of 1941. The Japanese Empire and the Soviet Union remained at peace. From the beginning of the war in the Pacific, the Soviet Union remained at peace and actually enjoyed, fairly cordial relations with Imperial Japan, even though they were allied with the United States in the fight against Nazi Germany. They were not united in this fight against Imperial Japan. That was not their fight. The regimes that ruled the Axis powers, they did not seize power by unconstitutional means. They were democratically put in place by. Oh, excuse me. They were democratically put in place by their citizenry. The Nazi Party, while not garnering a supermajority of the votes when Hitler came to power, was the largest political party in Germany at the time. Adolf Hitler was also vehement in his desire to destroy the Weimar Republic before he was elected. Now, that was no mystery. That was nothing that came out of left field. During his career before assuming power, it was one of his most touted major speaking points. Furthermore, Hitler, General Hideki Tojo, and Benito Mussolini were recognized as the leaders of legitimate governments at home and abroad long before the war broke out. To understand why, we must examine the draw and appeal of fascism to the post-industrial, post-World War I society, global society. For one thing, fascism had its roots in the Romantic movement of the late 19th century. It opposed both capitalism and communism, as well as democracy and individualism. It placed war on it looked at war in a highly favorable light. The core idea was intertwined with the belief that true freedom was acting with the group, not acting as an individual, not acting as a solitary person. It was acting with a group, with a single leader acting as that group's spirit. Fascism gained appeal in the post-World War I global society as more and more people came to see the hardships of life associated with the global depression as the failure of capitalism and democracy. It was emotionally appealing to those who were desperate to really find an explanation and to really escape these hardships. The appeal of fascism is generally a very hard concept to explain in the 21st century. Many people do not readily recognize it. They don't readily gravitate towards it. They don't really see how and why. The best way to understand the popularity of fascism, and this is something that I do when I explain it to my students or to just friends and family, is to tell them, is to sort of ask them to look at the way it's to sort of look at the way that people who want to belong to a part of a group behave. Um, the ideology behind true freedom not being the ideology behind true freedom being being not an individual but being a part of a group is rooted in this outlook that when you're attending organized events, be it a concert, a sporting event, or even a family event, um, strong emotions and strong responses are elicited from the observers and the attendees. The overawing feeling that one receives from the experience, either at a sporting event, at a concert, at a family event, at a school event, just being around like-minded individuals, that overawing feeling that you receive from that experience, that being a part of that group sums up the draw and appeal of fascism. If you, for example, are a fan or an admirer of comic books or just dressing up or of animation, if you go to one of the Comic-Con events, you certainly understand that. You go there and you're not singled out for liking Pokemon or Dragon Ball Z or Game of Thrones or Star Trek, Star Wars. All of these things that you may have been made fun of for liking, you find that you have kindred spirits. It goes to explain the appeal of nationalism and racism. People who often experience discrimination or who perceive that they experience discrimination, they often fall into these groups because it's an area where they can voice their opinions and find strong leadership, often very charismatic leadership, and a group with a strong set of ideas and beliefs. Political parties, even and particularly speaking of in the United States, political parties that differ along that have these very wide ideological gaps. You can sort of see that some people would hold to a leader, even if that leader or that figure has undesirable traits. They will still hold to that figure, to that person, not retrench, not back away, but they will hold to that figure, and no matter what, would they deviate from that figure, from the group associated with that figure. That's sort of an explanation for the draw and the appeal of fascism. Now, the Axis powers were not a united group by any means. They were not focused on the same goal. They were united in name only. There was serious distrust between those three powers. They never coordinated their militaries, nor did they share any of their intentions. Hitler, for his part, never informed his quote-unquote allies of his negotiations that led to the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or his intentions to invade Russia. The Japanese in April 1941 signed a neutrality agreement with the Russians. Mussolini never informed Hitler of his plan to invade Greece. The alliance between the three was a diplomatic bluff that was meant to compel potential adversaries into subservience or inaction, rather than having to fight all three of those powers. The United States was never an isolationist nation. Despite not joining the League of Nations, as we observed during our elections during the 1920s, the United States remained quite active in global affairs. The United States economy underwrote or undergirded the global security in the 1920s by ensuring that Germany had access to capital to rebuild her domestic infrastructure and to pay off those massive war reparations from World War I. The economic policies of the United States have provided the environment that fostered global security. The Isolation and Neutrality Acts of the 1930s were based on the idea that World War I had been avoidable actions, that World War I had been an avoidable action and should not be followed, and that the United States should not be allowed to simply drift into the next European Great War. Now, the policy of appeasement was not a new diplomatic policy at all. It was a measure that was designed to deter war, and it was not a bad policy. The United Kingdom had used appeasement agreements in regard to Germany since the 1920s. It was one of the oldest diplomatic measures, and it's still in place now. Now, the hang-up, the disconnect, was that Adolf Hitler could not be appeased. For appeasement to be a success, both parties must share the same values and the same goals. There were no shared values or goals between Neville Chamberlain and Adolf Hitler. Neville Chamberlain was not a career politician. He had been a businessman, and he miscalculated in his assessment of Adolf Hitler. He knew that Hitler was not an actual politician. He thought that with Hitler, he could make a business deal. He thought that if he treated Hitler like a businessman, Hitler would view it as a businessman's that would view their dealings as actions between businessmen who shared the same values. He was deeply wrong. He was very, very wrong in that assumption of Adolf Hitler. Appeasement allowed the Nazis to begin the war in a strengthened position, especially after the Munich talks in 1938. But now the Munich talks in 1938 also helped the British to prepare for war. After Munich, it became quite clear of what Adolf Hitler was. The British began to prepare for war. Began to prepare for war, and they were much better. They were in a much more prepared position in 1939 for war than they had been in 1938. Also in 1938, in 1939, when they did go to war, they did so with the full backing of the Commonwealth nations and of their various African and Caribbean colonies. And they did not have this backing in 1938. In 1939, regiments such as the King's Royal African Rifle Regiment, of which Idi Amin was a member of, and also a number of Afro-Caribbeans, the descendants of the former slaves in the Caribbean, also joined that war effort. A number of Jamaicans joined the fighting, Bahamians, Grenadians, people from St. Kitts and Nevis, and of course the Canadians, the South Africans, and the Australians. They all joined it. The Australians most notably during the Gallipoli campaign. That was quite disastrous for the Australian units there. Much controversy surrounds that as well, with a lot of people thinking that the United States sacrificed the lives of those men. But the Axis bid for victory in 1940-1941 was halted by the Chinese resistance fighters in East Asia, resisting the Japanese attempts to conquer China, and the Russians and the British in Europe. The material aid given to these nations did not lead to Pearl Harbor. The economic sanctions that the United States levied on Japan in 1940-1941, and the Japanese over-reliance on United States oil and steel products. Those were compounded by the opportunity the Nazi victories in Europe created for the Japanese in Southeast Asia. By attacking Southeast Asian colonies of the British, the French, and the Dutch. The decision to conquer these colonies in their backyards necessitated the attack on Pearl Harbor, which was undertaken to remove the threat posed by the United States fleet to the Japanese flank, had they conducted their southward movements. Now, Pearl Harbor became a target because of Roosevelt's decision to move the fleet from its California naval station to deter Japanese expansion. The deterrent became the ultimate target. Hitler had nothing to do with Pearl Harbor. Neither did Roosevelt. the role of historians really as analyzers and interpreters of the past. Our role as the analyzers and the interpreters of the past gives us access to much greater information than those who participated in the events that we cover. For example, we hold the view that Roosevelt, for those who hold the view, I should say, that Roosevelt was complicit in the attack in Pearl Harbor. They point to the fact that the United States had broken the Japanese codes in 1941 and therefore should have known that Pearl Harbor was going to be attacked. The United States had broken the Japanese codes, but these were the diplomatic codes, not the naval codes. Both sides were antsy and both sides were anticipating war. The United States expected the Philippines to be attacked, not Pearl Harbor. This was sound reasoning given the position of the Japanese troop ships, the proximity of the Philippines to Japan. The United States had a problem. They had too much information, which is just as bad as having too much information, too little information. I mean, that is known as noise. Critics also point to the fact that the battleships were at Pearl Harbor, which were increasingly becoming obsolete, not the aircraft carriers, which were becoming, which were to play a greater role in the Pacific. When the Japanese attacked, they did not know that the fleet had been separated. They thought that the battleships, the aircrafts, supplies, and the submarines were all going to be in one location, Pearl Harbor. Similarly, it was not until the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Midway that it became clear that the battleship had been replaced by the aircraft carrier. A conspiracy that would have resulted in the type of outcome that Pearl Harbor would have included the entire executive cabinet, the chief of staffs of the various service branches, and the belief that that Hitler would have stuck to a treaty he had signed for the first time in his life, for the first time in his capacity as the government leader, as the leader of the German nation. The agreement between Germany, Italy, and Japan, the tripartite pact, was a mutual defense agreement that called for aid if one of the three were attacked by a neutral power, and that neutral power was meant to be the United States. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States has puzzled everybody. It puzzled people back then. It puzzles us historians now. It puzzles World War II enthusiasts. It has done so since it was done. Now this act, and this act alone, Nazi Germany's declaration of war on the United States, linked these very regional wars, though not completely. And with that being said, we are going to break here, and we're going to come back with our last lecture. We're going to wrap up our lecture on World War II. As always, hit like, subscribe, and comment. I am Ted, and I will see you guys next time for our final lecture.